small town of Harmony, North Carolina, typically offered little in the way of dramatic events. Its residents lived lives characterized by routine and familiarity. It was in this setting, on a cool autumn morning, that local authorities received a distress call concerning a fatality at a quiet suburban home. The individual found deceased was Sarah Jenkins, a respected community member. Her husband, David Thompson, was present at the scene, visibly distressed as he recounted the circumstances to responding officers. Thompson explained that he discovered his wife, Sarah, in a bedroom, and that the scene suggested a self-inflicted act. The initial assessment by patrol officers aligned with this explanation. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, and the placement of certain items appeared consistent with Thompson's narrative. Given the sensitive nature of such incidents and the lack of immediate suspicious indicators, the local authorities in Harmony initially categorized Sarah Jenkins' death as a likely suicide. The community, though saddened, accepted this explanation, offering condolences to David Thompson and Sarah's extended family. The investigation, while thorough for a suspected suicide, concluded within a standard time frame. The medical examiner's preliminary findings, based on the apparent cause of death, supported the initial assessment. David Thompson cooperated fully with all inquiries, providing statements that painted a picture of a devoted husband grappling with his wife's sudden passing. He spoke of Sarah's personal struggles, details that, in the context of the apparent self-inflicted act, seemed to provide a tragic explanation. The death of Sarah Jenkins became a closed case within the records of the Harmony Police Department, a somber statistic within the town's history. Years passed in Harmony, and the memory of Sarah Jenkins' tragic death gradually receded from the forefront of public consciousness. David Thompson continued his life in the community, eventually relocating to a new town several states away. Life resumed its predictable course for those who remained. The case, filed away in cold storage, represented a completed inquiry, a life concluded by despair, or so it appeared. However, the passage of time often conceals deeper truths. The initial conclusion, based on surface appearances and the perpetrator's carefully constructed narrative, served its immediate purpose. It allowed an individual to evade scrutiny, to move forward unburdened by suspicion. The apparent lack of physical evidence, the staged environment, and the plausible story provided by the surviving spouse created a convincing illusion. Yet, the foundations of such deceptions are often fragile. They rely on the absence of comparative data, on the assumption that a singular event will remain isolated and unconnected to any future occurrences. The case of Sarah Jenkins' death was one such event. Seemingly isolated, seemingly understood, a tragic but resolved chapter. But the silence of years did not signify an absence of unresolved facts, merely a delay in their eventual uncovering. Years after the official closing of Sarah Jenkins' case in Harmony, North Carolina, David Thompson had indeed established a new life several states away, settling in the thriving suburban community of Fairview, Texas. He had built a new network of acquaintances, found new employment, and had, to all outward appearances, moved beyond the tragedy of his past. Time, as it often does, seemed to have dulled the sharp edges of that earlier event, rendering it a distant, isolated sorrow. In Fairview, David Thompson eventually entered into a new romantic relationship with Maria Rodriguez. Maria was a vibrant and well-regarded professional, known for her dedication and her warm demeanor. Their relationship developed over several years, progressing from casual dating to a committed partnership. They shared a home, built a joint life, and their relationship seemed stable and outwardly contented to those who knew them. There were no public indications of discord or underlying issues within their shared existence. Then, on a cold winter evening, nearly 8 years after Sarah Jenkins' death, tragedy struck David Thompson's life once again. Local authorities in Fairview, Texas, received a call reporting a fatality at the home he shared with Maria Rodriguez. Responding officers found Maria deceased and David Thompson present at the scene, displaying the same profound distress and grief he had exhibited years earlier in Harmony, North Carolina. Thompson's account to the Fairview officers echoed his previous narrative. He had discovered Maria, and the scene strongly suggested a self-inflicted act. The immediate visual evidence, along with Thompson's consistent and seemingly credible narrative, initially led the Fairview Police Department to, much like Harmony authorities before them, categorized Maria Rodriguez's death as a likely suicide. The circumstances surrounding her passing appeared, on the surface, to align with an individual taking their own life. There were no immediate signs of forced entry or struggle, and the arrangement of objects within the scene seemed consistent with Thompson's explanation. However, despite the initial categorization, something subtly different resonated with the investigators in Fairview. Detective Laura Evans, a seasoned officer with a keen eye for patterns, took charge of the investigation. While the immediate evidence pointed toward suicide, certain subtle inconsistencies prevented an immediate, definitive closure of the case. Maria Rodriguez was known among her colleagues and friends as an optimistic and resilient individual. While no life is without its private struggles, the abruptness of her apparent act, combined with her generally positive outlook, raised a quiet question mark in Detective Evans' mind. Furthermore, a routine background check on David Thompson, standard procedure for any individual present at a death scene, revealed the striking and unusual detail of his previous wife's death years prior, also being ruled a suicide. The coincidence of two romantic partners of the same individual dying by apparent self-inflicted acts, years apart in different states, immediately flagged the case for deeper scrutiny. While not inherently indicative of foul play, it moved the investigation from a routine inquiry to one demanding meticulous reevaluation. This was no longer just a single, isolated incident. It was now part of a unique and statistically improbable pattern. Detective Evans, with her team, began to approach Maria Rodriguez's case with an elevated level of scrutiny, re-examining every detail, no matter how minor. They looked beyond the surface narrative provided by David Thompson. They initiated a comprehensive review of Maria's life, speaking with her family, friends, and co-workers, seeking a more complete understanding of her emotional state, her relationships, and any potential stressors that might have been overlooked in an initial assessment. The presence of a repeating pattern, linking two seemingly separate tragedies through a common individual, demanded a level of vigilance and analytical detachment that would, in time, begin to unravel a complex deception. The immediate aftermath of Maria Rodriguez's death in Fairview, Texas, saw Detective Laura Evans initiating a thorough and highly meticulous investigation, driven by the unsettling coincidence of David Thompson's past. Her team began by re-examining every facet of Maria's life, scrutinizing her personal communications, financial records, and health history with a level of detail usually reserved for cases with overt signs of foul play. They interviewed Maria's family and extensive network of friends and professional colleagues, seeking a comprehensive understanding of her emotional state in the weeks and months leading up to her passing. Maria was consistently described as resilient, goal-oriented, and generally possessing a robust emotional constitution. While she, like any individual, experienced periods of stress, no one recounted anything that indicated a severe depressive state or proclivity for self-harm. This consistent portrayal of Maria as a stable individual created a subtle, yet persistent, dissonance with the scene David Thompson had presented. The statistical improbability of two successive partners of the same individual dying by apparent self-inflicted acts, years apart and in different states, became the central, unignorable red flag for Detective Evans. This was not merely an unusual coincidence. It defied common statistical likelihoods. Recognizing the gravity of this pattern, Detective Evans formally reached out to the Harmony Police Department in North Carolina. She spoke with Chief Miller, outlining the specifics of Maria Rodriguez's case and gently inquiring about the details surrounding Sarah Jenkins' death nearly 8 years prior. The initial response from Harmony was one professional courtesy, tinged with a degree of surprise at the renewed interest in a case long considered closed. Obtaining the full case file for Sarah Jenkins proved to be a challenging logistical exercise. Years had passed, personnel had changed, and physical evidence from an ostensibly closed suicide case was often stored differently or even purged after a specific retention period. When the older files finally arrived in Fairview, shipped across state lines, they provided a stark contrast to the fresh, ongoing investigation of Maria's death. The documentation from Harmony was thinner, the photographs less detailed, and the witness statements less extensive, reflecting the different investigative protocols applied to a suspected suicide compared to a suspected homicide. However, Detective Evans and her team meticulously cross-referenced every detail from Sarah's case with what they were learning about Maria's passing. David Thompson, throughout this heightened scrutiny, maintained a remarkably consistent demeanor. He presented as a man deeply grieving the loss of his second partner, cooperated with all police inquiries, yet subtly conveying a weary resignation to what he implied were tragic turns of fate in his life. He provided extensive statements, recounting Maria's alleged periods of despondency, echoing the narrative he had provided years earlier about Sarah. He never hesitated to answer questions, never openly displayed anger or defensiveness, a composure that, while seemingly cooperative, began to subtly register as unnaturally calm under the intense pressure of a homicide investigation. His consistency, intended to project innocence, began to subtly suggest a rehearsed performance. As Detective Evans' team delved deeper, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge, chipping away at the seemingly straightforward suicide narratives. In Sarah Jenkins' case file, there were minor discrepancies in the descriptions of the scene provided by Thompson versus the observations recorded by the first responding officers, though these had been dismissed at the time as standard variations in memory. In Maria Rodriguez's case, Maria's financial accounts revealed recent, unexpected deposits, and her professional calendar showed upcoming commitments that seemed to contradict a mindset of despair. There were also very minor, almost imperceptible, nuances in the way certain items were positioned at both scenes that, when viewed through a lens of potential staging rather than genuine distress, began to take on a more ominous significance. No single piece of evidence immediately screamed homicide, but the accumulation of these small, almost imperceptible discrepancies, when viewed through the lens of a repeating pattern, started to paint a different picture. The most critical challenge was a lack of direct, undeniable physical evidence of foul play at either scene. The alleged method of death in both instances had, by design, left minimal trace evidence that would immediately point away from suicide. This meant Detective Evans' team needed to rely on a painstaking process of elimination, of disproving the suicide narrative through cumulative circumstantial evidence and behavioral analysis. They began to focus on David Thompson himself, not just as a grieving partner, but as the one common denominator in two strikingly similar, tragic events. His detailed background, his routines, his digital footprint, and his past interactions with both victims became the central nexus of the renewed inquiry. The task was complex, requiring interstate collaboration, the revival of a cold case, and the ability to discern malevolent intent hidden beneath layers of apparent tragedy. The investigation was transforming from a simple death inquiry into a hunt for a serial deceiver. The convergence of two nearly identical tragedies, separated by years and state lines, propelled Detective Laura Evans' investigation into David Thompson with a heightened analytical intensity. Her team in Fairview began a comprehensive deep dive into Thompson's entire life history, stretching back decades. They meticulously scrutinized his financial records, examining bank statements, credit history, and investment portfolios from both his time in North Carolina and his more recent years in Texas. This extensive review revealed a recurring pattern. Both Sarah Jenkins and Maria Rodriguez had possessed substantial life insurance policies, with David Thompson listed as the sole beneficiary. Furthermore, both women had experienced recent significant financial windfalls or substantial personal assets before their deaths, Sarah through an inheritance from a distant relative, and Maria through a successful business venture and subsequent sale of property. Thompson had then initiated the process of claiming these policies and assets with considerable haste following each woman's passing. This financial motive, consistent across both cases, provided a chilling, undeniable through line. The focus then shifted to the meticulous re-examination of the staging aspect of both death scenes. Detective Evans, with the assistance of seasoned forensic pathologists, began to scrutinize the original case files with a new lens, that of deliberate manipulation rather than genuine despair. In Sarah Jenkins' original case, certain details previously dismissed as inconsequential began to stand out. The placement of a chair, the angle of the specific item, the very method used for the apparent self-inflicted act, when compared against statistical probabilities and behavioral patterns in genuine suicides, started to appear subtly off. It was not glaringly obvious, but a collection of minor inconsistencies that, in isolation, meant little, but together suggested orchestration. For Maria Rodriguez's case, which was still relatively fresh, Detective Evans had the advantage of more detailed contemporary forensic data. While the initial scene had pointed to suicide, new insights emerged. Specific toxicology reports, reevaluated in light of the new suspicions, showed trace elements of a sedative in Maria's system. Not enough to be lethal on its own, but sufficient to induce drowsiness or incapacitation. This suggested that Maria may have been rendered vulnerable just prior to her death, undermining the narrative of a fully conscious, self-directed act. The absence of defensive wounds on Maria, despite a struggle often associated with the stated method of death, also became a crucial point of discrepancy. Technological avenues also yielded significant counter-narratives. While David Thompson's phone records showed cooperation, a deeper dive into his digital footprint revealed subtle contradictions. His online search history, recovered from a cloud backup associated with an older device, contained queries for painless methods and insurance beneficiary laws months prior to Maria Rodriguez's death, and similar, though less distinct, queries could be inferred from fragments of data recovered from a discarded hard drive associated with his Harmony residence years earlier. These searches, entirely inconsistent with the persona of a grief-stricken partner, directly challenge his repeated claims of shock and ignorance regarding the circumstances of their deaths. They painted a picture of premeditation and research. The interstate collaboration between the Fairview Police Department and the Harmony Police Department intensified dramatically. Chief Miller and Harmony, now fully convinced by Detective Evans' comprehensive and alarming findings, dispatched a veteran detective from his own force to Fairview. This direct collaboration allowed for the pooling of insights and a critical exchange of information. The Harmony detective, familiar with the nuances of Sarah Jenkins' initial case, could now offer context to the seemingly innocuous details that had once been overlooked, explaining the layout of the old house, the typical behaviors of Sarah and Thompson's actions in the immediate aftermath. This shared knowledge allowed both departments to construct a unified timeline and a far more robust understanding of David Thompson's modus operandi, revealing a chillingly consistent pattern of financial motivation and careful staging. As the scrutiny intensified and the evidence against him mounted, subtle cracks began to appear in David Thompson's carefully constructed facade of grief and cooperation. While he continued to respond to inquiries, his responses became more guarded, his answers more vague. He occasionally stumbled over timelines or contradicted minor details previously provided. He attempted to deflect suspicion by subtly suggesting alternative explanations for the presence of certain evidence or financial records, but his arguments lacked the coherence that characterizes initial, rehearsed narratives. His composure, once unwavering, began to show the strain of a man under immense, undeniable pressure. The belief that he had successfully concealed his actions, nurtured over years of apparent impunity, was now rapidly eroding. The meticulously staged scenes, once his greatest alibis, were slowly but surely transforming into irrefutable evidence of his calculated deceit. The meticulous groundwork laid by Detective Laura Evans and the collaborative efforts between the Fairview, Texas, and Harmony, North Carolina, police departments began to coalesce into an undeniable portrait of deception. The financial motive, the pattern of two apparent suicides, and the subtle inconsistencies at both scenes built a powerful circumstantial case against David Thompson. However, to move from strong suspicion to irrefutable proof, a definitive, scientific breakthrough was required to dismantle Thompson's carefully constructed narrative of tragedy. That breakthrough arrived through the exhaustive re-examination of forensic evidence, particularly for Maria Rodriguez's case, which offered more pristine samples due to its recent occurrence. A seasoned forensic pathologist, brought in as consulted by Detective Evans, conducted an independent and highly specialized review of Maria's autopsy report, photographs, and toxicology results. While the initial findings had pointed towards suicide, the pathologist focused on microscopic details and specific physiological responses that distinguished genuine self-inflicted injuries from those inflicted by another. The re-evaluation focused on nuances in ligature marks, the presence of specific petechial hemorrhages, and the precise angle and depth of certain injuries, all of which, when combined with the sedative found in Maria's system, became highly indicative of post-mortem staging rather than a self-inflicted act. The pathologist's expert conclusion was unambiguous. Maria Rodriguez's death was a homicide, meticulously designed to mimic suicide. Simultaneously, a behavioral profiler from a federal agency, brought in to analyze David Thompson's consistent demeanor across both tragedies, provided critical insight. The profiler highlighted Thompson's blunted effect. His seemingly appropriate grief that lacked true emotional depth and his consistent, almost rehearsed narrative. This, combined with his subtle attempts to guide investigators towards suicide conclusions and his detailed knowledge of the victim's alleged vulnerabilities, painted a profile consistent with a perpetrator seeking to control the narrative and deflect suspicion. The pattern of his immediate actions following each death, particularly his swift moves to claim life insurance benefits, further solidified this analysis. The evidence from Sarah Jenkins' older case, though less complete, gained new clarity in light of these findings. While direct forensic re-examination was challenging due to the passage of time, the behavioral insights into Thompson, coupled with the proven staging in Maria's death, allowed investigators to revisit the original reports with a critical lens. Minor discrepancies from the initial Harmony investigation, previously overlooked, now aligned with the template of manipulation uncovered in Fairview. It became evident that Thompson had employed a strikingly similar methodology in both instances, adapting his tactics only slightly to local circumstances and the changing legal landscape over the years. The pressure on David Thompson intensified. He was called in for another round of questioning, this time at the Fairview Police Department, not as a grieving witness, but as the central focus of a homicide investigation. The interrogation was led by Detective Evans, who meticulously presented the accumulated evidence. She began by detailing the discrepancies in his financial history, confronting him with the life insurance policies and the timing of his claims. Then came the revelation of sedative in Maria Rodriguez's system, directly contradicting his narrative of her full consciousness. Finally, she presented the expert forensic pathologist's revised findings. Maria Rodriguez's death was unequivocally a homicide, deliberately staged. Thompson's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. His calm demeanor fractured, replaced by visible agitation and a rapid succession of defensive denials. He attempted to weave new, increasingly convoluted explanations for the evidence, blaming medical errors, misinterpretations, and suggesting external factors. However, each attempt at deflection was met with irrefutable data. The precise timestamps from his internet search history, the detailed financial trails, the expert forensic analysis, and the undeniable pattern linking both victims. He was confronted with the fact that two separate police departments, thousands of miles apart, had independently arrived at the same chilling conclusion about his actions. As the weight of the evidence became overwhelming, and his lies offered no further refuge, David Thompson's resistance finally collapsed. His denials became weaker, his arguments more desperate. He was formally placed under arrest for the murder of Maria Rodriguez. The charges related to Sarah Jenkins' death in North Carolina would follow, handled through interstate coordination and a grand jury indictment. The years he had spent living under the illusion of having successfully deceived authorities had come to an end. The meticulous work of two dedicated police departments, bridging time and distance, had finally unveiled a complex, heinous pattern of repeated homicides disguised as suicide. The pursuit of justice, often a protracted journey, had finally reached its turning point, bringing accountability for the lives David Thompson had deliberately extinguished. The arrest of David Thompson for the murder of Maria Rodriguez in Fairview, Texas, sent profound ripple through legal and law enforcement communities across two states. It was a critical turning point that allowed Harmony, North Carolina, authorities to definitively reclassify Sarah Jenkins' death from a long-standing cold case suicide to an active homicide investigation. The collaboration, previously a measured exchange of information, now became an urgent, fully integrated operation. Detectives from both departments shared every detail, every piece of evidence, and every subtle insight gathered over years of separate inquiries, pooling resources to build two formidable prosecution cases against a single, cunning perpetrator. The evidence meticulously assembled by Detective Laura Evans' team in Fairview was presented to a Texas grand jury with overwhelming force. The detailed forensic reevaluations, the unsettling consistency of Thompson's narrative at both death scenes, and the irrefutable financial motivations formed a compelling narrative. The grand jury swiftly returned a first-degree murder indictment against David Thompson for Maria Rodriguez's death, affirming the strength of the prosecution's initial findings. This legal victory paved the way for Thompson's extradition to North Carolina, a process handled with precision by interstate legal teams. In Harmony, North Carolina, a separate grand jury, informed by the unfolding events in Texas and the newly re-examined older evidence, also returned an indictment for the murder of Sarah Jenkins. David Thompson was now poised to face two distinct murder trials in two separate states, a direct consequence of his calculated, repeated deceptions. The trial for the murder of Maria Rodriguez commenced first in a packed Texas courtroom, drawing significant public and media attention. The prosecution, led by a seasoned district attorney, presented a systematic, devastating case. Their opening statements painted a stark picture of premeditated murder masked by a meticulously staged scene. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a renowned forensic pathologist, provided the initial pivotal testimony. She walked the jury through the intricacies of her re-evaluation of Maria's autopsy. Dr. Reed detailed the precise nature of the ligature marks, explaining how their pattern and depth were not consistent with self-infliction, but rather with external application by another party. She elaborated on the specific presence of petechial hemorrhages, tiny pinpoint red spots, which, in their location and density, strongly indicated a struggle in sustained pressure, contrasting sharply with typical suicide scenarios. Furthermore, Dr. Reed explained how the discovery of a non-lethal sedative in Maria's system suggested incapacitation, undermining the defense's argument of a fully aware, voluntary act. Her expert testimony effectively dismantled the suicide narrative with scientific certainty. The prosecution then called Dr. Alan Cross, a nationally recognized behavioral profiler. Dr. Cross meticulously analyzed David Thompson's consistent demeanor following both deaths, highlighting his blunted effect, a seeming display of grief that lacked genuine emotional depth and variability. He contrasted this with typical reactions of truly bereaved spouses, describing Thompson's narrative as remarkably consistent, almost rehearsed, a characteristic often observed in individuals attempting to control public perception. The profiler connected Thompson's calculated composure to his meticulous staging of the scenes, demonstrating a pattern of psychological manipulation designed to misdirect investigators. The financial motive was laid bare with undeniable clarity by Ms. Olivia Vance, a forensic accountant. Ms. Vance presented intricate details of Maria Rodriguez's significant life insurance policies, several of which had been increased or taken out just months before her death, with David Thompson as the sole beneficiary. She meticulously traced the rapid succession with which Thompson initiated claims after Maria's passing and detailed the immediate transfer of Maria's substantial personal assets and liquid funds into his accounts. The stark financial gain served as an undeniable driving force behind the crime. Thompson's digital footprint then became a damning witness. A cyber forensics expert detailed the recovery of specific search terms from Thompson's older devices, terms like painless methods, undetectable poisons, and insurance beneficiary laws, conducted months prior to Maria's death. These queries directly contradicted his claims of shock and ignorance, painting a chilling portrait of premeditation. Witnesses included Maria's family, who spoke of her positive outlook and future plans, directly refuting the idea of suicidal ideation. A colleague from Maria's workplace testified about a recent promotion she received and her excitement for upcoming projects, making a suicide explanation even more incongruous. David Thompson's defense team mounted a vigorous counterargument. They attempted to discredit the forensic findings as subjective interpretations, the behavioral profiling as speculative, and the financial transactions as merely routine spousal actions in a time of grief. Thompson himself advised not to testify, maintained an outward composure for much of the trial, occasionally offering a controlled shake of the head or a subtle frown when incriminating evidence was presented, attempting to project an image of a man wrongly accused. However, under the prosecution's relentless cross-examination of his character witnesses and the sheer weight of cumulative evidence, his meticulously crafted alibis and explanations crumbled. Each attempt at deflection was met with irrefutable data, exposing the inconsistencies of his carefully constructed lies. After weeks of compelling testimony and meticulous presentation of evidence, the jury, after careful and extensive deliberation, returned a verdict. David Thompson was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Maria Rodriguez. The courtroom, packed with Maria's family and friends, reacted with a palpable, quiet exhale of relief and solemn vindication. Justice, for Maria, had been delivered in Texas. Following his conviction in Texas, David Thompson was expeditiously extradited to North Carolina to face trial for the murder of Sarah Jenkins. This trial presented a unique set of challenges due to the passage of nearly 8 years since Sarah's death. Some physical evidence from the original scene was less preserved, and memories of certain witnesses had naturally faded. However, the North Carolina prosecution, working in close and direct collaboration with Detective Evans and leveraging the comprehensive findings from the Texas trial, presented an equally devastating case. They introduced the power of the established modus operandi, the chilling pattern of financial motivation, the calculated staging of the scene, and Thompson's consistent behavior following both deaths. The North Carolina prosecution called upon the same forensic pathologist who testified in Texas, Dr. Evelyn Reed, who explained how, even with older evidence, the subtle discrepancies in Sarah's original autopsy report and crime scene photographs, when viewed through the lens of established staging techniques, align precisely with the patterns found in Maria's case. Former officers from Harmony PD testified, recounting their initial observations and Thompson's narrative, now reinterpreted as part of a calculated deception. Sarah's family and friends testified about her life, her recent inheritance, and her future aspirations, directly challenging the initial suicide conclusion. The financial transactions around Sarah's life insurance policies and assets were presented in detail, mirroring the motive that led to Maria's death. The defense in North Carolina attempted to argue that the previous conviction in Texas was irrelevant to this older case, and that the evidence was too stale to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. They tried to portray Sarah's original death as a genuine, tragic suicide. However, the cumulative power of the pattern, the expert testimony, and the detailed financial trail proved too strong. The jury in North Carolina, presented with the undeniable and horrifying consistency of Thompson's actions across 2 lives in 2 states, also found David Thompson guilty of the murder of Sarah Jenkins. The dual convictions brought a profound and necessary sense of closure to the families of both Sarah Jenkins and Maria Rodriguez. David Thompson, the man who had meticulously staged 2 murders years apart, believing his deception was foolproof, faced a grim reality. He was sentenced to consecutive life terms in state prison in both Texas and North Carolina, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his existence incarcerated, with no possibility of parole. His carefully constructed illusion of tragedy had been systematically dismantled by the relentless dedication of 2 separate police departments who refused to accept surface explanations when faced with an improbable, horrifying pattern. The case stood as a stark reminder that while perpetrators may attempt to erase their tracks and manipulate the truth, the persistence of dedicated law enforcement, coupled with the undeniable power of forensic analysis, pattern recognition, and interstate collaboration, can ultimately expose even the most cunning deceptions, ensuring that justice, however delayed, will ultimately prevail for the victims. The calculated acts of a serial deceiver were finally unmasked, bringing accountability for the lives David Thompson had deliberately and coldly extinguished.
Thank you for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more.